There was a time when the Shawnee warrior was the arch-nemesis of the Kentucky militiamen. For decades, these two groups were entangled in bitter conflict. In the War of 1812, a new generation of Kentuckians would pick up their rifles and battle the natives once again. In May of 1813, during the Siege of Fort Meigs, the Kentucky militia under the command of General Green Clay was given a special mission to silence British cannons bombarding the fort from the north. The task of leading the raiders was assigned to Colonel William Dudley, who led 800 men up the Maumee River. The Kentucky governor, Isaac Shelby, warned General Harrison that he wasn't exactly sending their best. Many of them were young and feeble, but at the same time they were eager to avenge their fellow countrymen who were slaughtered at the River Raisin a few months earlier. Ironically, this militia also included Shawnee scouts. These were Shawnees who were ideologically aligned with the leader Blackhoof, who took a more accommodating stance towards U.S. expansion and opposed Tecumseh's Confederacy. On the morning of May 5th, American regulars successfully silenced British cannons east of the fort, but it was costly. Tecumseh's forces launched a counterattack and regained the position, killing 30 of the regulars and wounding 90 more. However, the guns were already spiked. Now it was up to the Kentuckians to silence the northern battery position. Dudley's men landed on the north bank of the Maumee, west of Fort Meigs, and southwest of the British batteries. Some of the men were already drunk. Others were sick and cold from being out in the rain. They were confused and unsure what their mission objectives actually were. Only the officers seemed to know what was going on. The mission started out well enough. The militia fired upon the battery position, and the battle cries of the Kentucky boys sent the redcoats fleeing eastward into the woods. The Americans on the other side of the river, watching from Fort Meigs, cheered them on as the enemy cannons fell silent. The cannons were captured without losing a single man. It seemed like these ragtag Kentuckians would come home heroes. Except there was one problem. The equipment needed to spike the cannons was nowhere to be found. It turns out the men in charge of this equipment landed on the wrong side of the river. So Colonel Dudley and the Kentuckians sort of loitered around a bit, trying to figure out what to do. Meanwhile, Harrison at Fort Meigs was confused as to why they were still over there instead of retreating to the boats. Behind the battery position, there was a sudden hail of gunfire. A few Shawnee scouts went to investigate, and a small skirmish ensued. After trading a few shots, the enemy skirmishers retreated further into the woods. The rest of the Kentuckians couldn't resist pursuing them, which is exactly what the native forces wanted. "Remember the raisin," Dudley shouted, as the militia pressed forward, but their highest spirits disappeared after they heard the howling war whoops of hundreds of warriors on all sides. Colonel Dudley was shot just minutes after the fight started. He clinched his wound, then met his fate at the end of a tomahawk. His second-in-command cut himself while drawing his sword and fled into the woods. Another officer, Captain John Morrison, took a bullet through the temple, causing his eyeballs to burst from his skull. Some of the more stubborn Kentuckians pressed on, returning fire and taunting the enemy. But their war cries were quickly silenced and replaced by the war whoops of the enemy. The Kentuckians were dropping like flies. Without officers, they were nothing but a rabble. Some of the men were frozen with fear and instantly shot dead or hacked to pieces. If they were lucky, they encountered a redcoat who would demand that they ground their arms. The native coalition, on the other hand, was out for blood. One Kentuckian wandered the battlefield in shock, missing his scalp. He approached a British soldier asking for water. Before the redcoat could react, the scalpless man was finished off by a warrior. The Kentuckians who retreated fell back to the battery position, hoping to regroup and return to the river. Instead, they met a small company of redcoats who slipped behind them. The remaining militia laid down their arms and surrendered. Hundreds of prisoners were forced to march eastward, towards what was left of the old Fort Miami. Among the prisoners was a 16-year-old private named Thomas Christian, who recalled that dreadful day decades later. Fearing that this was his last day on Earth, young Thomas thought about the last time he saw his parents, back in the small settlement of Athens in Fayette County, Kentucky. He remembered the fresh, clean faces of his fellow volunteers, many of which are now corpses stuck in the mud. He remembered his mother's teary eyes, and in his memories he could hear his father's voice. "Goodbye, my boy," he said before they marched north. When Thomas fell in with the other prisoners, he clinged on to his roundabout coat, which was a precious gift from his mother. The redcoat officers warned the prisoners not to resist the natives during the march, and to give up any clothing or trinkets that were demanded from them. The warriors harassed the prisoners, snatching off hats, shirts, picking their pockets, and pretty much doing anything they pleased. Anyone who fought back was immediately cut down. The redcoats had no control over their Indian allies. Private Thomas Christian caught the eye of a young painted warrior who approached him with a raised tomahawk. He braced himself as he waited for the weapon to meet his skull. Instead, the warrior snatched a brass inkstand from his pocket and showed it off to his pals. The silver dollars in his pockets were also taken. In front of the entrance to the old fort, the painted warriors formed 2 large columns. Each prisoner would have to run the gauntlet to get in. The officers assured the prisoners that they'd be safe once they made it through. They had no time to prepare and were immediately forced to run the gauntlet. Many of the prisoners were knocked to the ground as they ran past the howling warriors. Some didn't get back up, and their bloodied corpses littered the entranceway. Others crawled on all fours, desperately trying to make their way into the apparent safety of the fort. Private Christian stood next in line as he watched the fellow in front of him take a massive gash in the shoulder. When it was his turn, he ran faster than he had ever ran before. He reached the entranceway, but suddenly his arms were pulled behind him, and a button from his coat popped out in front. The warriors ripped the coat from his torso, and that was the last he ever saw of his mother's precious gift. The prisoners were corralled into a section of the fort like lambs to the slaughter. Many of the Kentuckians thought they were safe, but unfortunately for them, the bloodbath wasn't over. An Ojibwa war party showed up, led by a warrior named Split Log. They were late to the fight, but were not about to go home empty-handed. Split Log aimed his rifle at the cluster of prisoners and pulled the trigger. A Kentuckian dropped dead. He reloaded, fired, and another dropped dead. The rest of the war party joined in. They dropped their rifles, drew their tomahawks and scalping knives, and began indiscriminately slaughtering the prisoners. A redcoat sentry got between the warriors and the prisoners and asked them to stand down, only to be shot with a pistol. The other redcoats stepped aside and the killing continued. Thomas Christian describes the gruesome scene in his narrative. Quote, "The savages rudely shoved the British sentinels aside, and with unearthly yells poured in upon us, killing and scalping as fast as their own crowded ranks would admit, while we, like terror-stricken sheep, hemmed in by dogs or a parcel of hogs in a butcher's pen, were piled up upon another in one corner. Those at the bottom were being smothered, while those upon the top were being drenched with blood and brains." End quote. The helpless Kentuckians prayed for God's mercy and salvation. The answer to their prayers would come from an unexpected source. During the slaughter, a chief riding on a dapple-gray horse rushed in, and the killing ceased instantly. Thomas continues in his narrative. Quote, "Suddenly, as a lightning flash, the yelling ceased. The uplifted war clubs descended harmlessly by the sides of the now shamed warriors, and above the groans of the dying and the prayers of the living is heard the brave Tecumseh putting a stop to the massacre, shaming his warriors for behaving like squaws." End quote. Tecumseh addressed the warriors in a tongue the Kentuckians couldn't understand, but judging by his demeanor, they knew he was merciful. For a moment, they had forgotten that he was one of the leaders of their enemy, and were in awe of his charisma. Split Log tried to argue with Tecumseh, but the Shawnee leader wasn't having it, and dismissed the humiliated warrior. The old veteran Indian agent, Matthew Elliott, stood at Tecumseh's side with his sword drawn, ready to strike down anyone who laid their hands on unarmed prisoners. The Kentuckians were spared, but for some it would be a while before they were set free. Many of them found themselves adopted into Indian families. Young Thomas Christian, however, did eventually make it home and reunited with his family. He was also lucky enough to sit out for the rest of the war. Of the 800 Kentucky militia, around 70 were killed, 580 were captured, and only 150 made it back to Fort Meigs. Tecumseh wasn't finished reprimanding his native brothers for their treatment of prisoners. The day after the massacre at Old Fort Miami, Tecumseh set out for a Wyandotte camp where the Shawnee scouts who were with Dudley's company were being tortured. Though the Shawnees fought for the other side, Tecumseh couldn't bear to see them tortured and humiliated, so he demanded they be released. He shook hands with his fellow Shawnees, but also made it a point to remind them that they chose the wrong side. News of Tecumseh's actions spread far and wide, and he became seen even by some of the Americans he opposed as a figure akin to Robin Hood or William Wallace. By 1813, the final year of his life, he had already achieved a kind of celebrity status. People in the eastern states, removed from the hardships of the frontier, often romanticized him as a noble savage, dissociating him from the accounts of native attacks. One newspaper out of Philadelphia even hailed him as the boldest Indian warrior of the West. Tecumseh's intervention to save prisoners from slaughter is one of the most famous accounts of the great Shawnee leader's compassion. While he was not always above seeking vengeance, and some might argue that his actions were partly motivated by the need to maintain discipline among his warriors who were heavily dependent on British support, but his humanity was undeniable. This is especially remarkable given the immense hardship he endured in his early life at the hands of the settlers, particularly those from Kentucky. Tecumseh's actions at Fort Meigs offer a rare glimpse of honor and restraint in an era defined by brutality and vengeance. Though he was a feared enemy of the Kentuckians, on that day he became their protector, stepping in even when British officers had lost control. His courage wasn't just measured on the battlefield, but in his willingness to stand against his own allies to defend the dignity of human life. In the chaos of war, Tecumseh remained a man of principle. And while history remembers many warriors for the lives they took, Tecumseh is remembered rightly for the lives he spared. This is among the many reasons why he became a folk hero in both Canada and the United States. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and as always, take care.